I'm frequently asked about term limits. So I thought I'd take some time and ponder that next on the Constitution Study.
There's one thing you have to know wherever you make your stand. Came from a long through line of everyday Americans.
Hello there, everyday Americans. Paul Engel here with the Constitution Study, where we read and study the Constitution and we teach the rising generation to be free. I'm glad you could join me today. As always, please head to the website, constitutionstudy.com, where you'll find everything about the Constitution Study. I'm going to ask you to sign up for the newsletter. All my news, all my announcements come out first in the newsletter. It's the quickest, easiest way to find out when I've got new products, new tools available to you. It all starts there. And you can also hit the checkbox and have these videos and my other articles delivered to your inbox when they're released twice a week. You don't need to worry about finding them on Facebook or YouTube. They're just there. It's also where you can ask questions. Please, I love when people ask questions. This topic came from people asking questions. Who knows? Your question you may think it's not a big deal, but other people may be asking the very same question. So don't be shy. I don't bite. Put in your question, and if it's, I'll answer it as quickly as I can. And if there's enough interest, I may even do an episode on it. So be part of the group, do that, support the work that we're doing through spreading the news, through letting other people know. It's how we can return rights and liberty to this country, is by educating ourselves. And hopefully you consider the Constitution Study a tool worthy of that goal. So let's talk about term limits. Yeah, every so often we seem to go through a wave of people, term limits is the answer, term limits is the answer, term limits is the answer. Well, while I used to agree with that, I'm not convinced. Now understand, like I said, I didn't start out anti-term limits, but it took some time of pondering what's actually going on. So let's take the one example in the United States Constitution of term limits, and that is the limit on the president. Now, a little bit of history, right? George Washington, our very first president, after 2 terms, said enough is enough. He went home to Mount Vernon. He didn't want to serve. He wasn't going to do it anymore. And that kind of became a de facto standard. Now, there were people who tried to get a 3rd term, but no one was able to. Which that was until the 1940s and Franklin Delano Roosevelt. I find it interesting because he served 2 terms and then said he wouldn't serve a 3rd term unless he was drafted. And then he was drafted. And then, of course, he started a 4th term, but he died shortly thereafter. Now, here's where life gets interesting. Because in the next election, the Republican candidates ran on the idea of term limits for the president. We can't allow another president to have that much time. If you don't remember, Roosevelt wasn't a Republican, not that Roosevelt. He was a Democrat. In other words, his political opponents didn't want him or anyone else to have the opportunity to serve more than 2 terms as president. And they used that as a campaigning strategy. And not just for the office of president, for Congress and the Senate as well, to propose a constitutional amendment to limit the term of the president, because we just can't let that happen. You notice it wasn't the Democrats that were saying, you know what, this is too much. See, the first problem I have with term limits is the people that are asking for them are almost always the people who are losing the elections. If the person's winning the election, well, they don't worry about term limits. It's the people who are losing, the people who cannot beat the incumbent who said, well, we have to limit them. And understand, when we're talking about term limits, we often think, well, we're limiting the candidate, the person in office. The president is limited to 2 terms. Well, what really happening is the states are limited to only electing the same person for 2 terms. The people who choose the electors, when they are considering who they want to be as president, their choice is limited. It's not so much that we're limiting the candidate, we're limiting the choice of the American people. That's kind of my second issue with term limits. My third issue really comes down to, would a term limit be effective? So let me ask you, we've had term limits in the presidency since the late 1940s. Have we seen different parties in the presidency? Yeah. They tend to go through cycles, right? You'll get a couple terms of one party, and then a couple terms of another party, and they kind of flow back and forth. But has government gotten any smaller? Has the trajectory of what the government is doing really changed all that much? Oh, sure, there are short periods of time where there are drastic changes, but for the most part, the power of the presidency has been growing steadily since actually before the 1940s, since back in the 1920s. Term limits hasn't changed that. People say, well, term limits will get fresh blood in. Yeah, but that fresh blood comes from a same party system. In effect, you're playing musical chairs in the Titanic. The name may change, but if the philosophy, if the worldview, if the governing standards of the person in the office doesn't change, nothing substantially changes. I've heard people claim that would diminish the power of party. I think it'd do the exact opposite. See, now, if you want to beat an incumbent, you have to beat an incumbent. If it's your same party, you still have to beat the incumbent. It's still pretty hard, but you have to do it. But if that incumbent was term limited, guess what's going to happen? The party's going to groom the next person in line. And we'll have that musical chairs. The names will change, but they're still indebted to the party. Therefore, they're still influenced by the party. Therefore, the party is still in control. It doesn't fix the problem. In fact, I think what it would do is turn the lower offices, the state offices, and below, into a farm system, like baseball. You know, you enter in at the minor leagues and you work your way up, and eventually, if you're really good and you kiss the right backsides and you pay the right people and you support the right things, well, then you get your chance at the big show. Congress, Senate, President. But only if you're a good party loyalist. See, the one thing that really bothers me about term limits is they miss something very, very important. When you implement term limits, you do not change the people voting for the office. When we term limited presidents, we didn't change the people who chose the electors who eventually chose the president. So you have the same people voting for the same reasons, for the same candidates, lying about the same things. Okay, what does it matter? To me, you've missed the root cause of the problem. The cause of the problem isn't the fact that a particular person sits in an office for an extended period of time. The problem is the people that person works for keeps voting to send them there. And let's face it, most people who want term limits don't like who other people are choosing to be their representatives, whether it's Congress, Senate, or the president. Most of the people I hear talking about term limits, it's sour grapes because their team keeps losing or their preferred candidate keeps losing. It's because you're trying to change the wrong thing. See, rather than focusing now that time and effort on term limits, we should be focusing on educating the electorate. You see, each and every elected office has a job review. Remember, when we elect somebody, we're hiring them as a public servant to represent us in some manner or form. They work for us. They're our hirelings. And every re-election is a job review. Whether it's 2, 4, or 6 years, it's a job review. Most people don't look at elections that way. They simply vote for their team. Or they vote the person with the best hair. Or they vote the person that tells the best lies. But they never stop and look and say, wait a second, this person swore or affirmed to support the Constitution. How good a job did they do? Term limits is missing the point. Each and every office is term limited by the people they represent. If a congressman has served 6 terms and that's enough, you convince enough of your fellow electors to not vote for him anymore or her anymore because they've served enough, that person's gone. If you think a senator should only serve 2 terms and you convince enough of the other people in your state that a U.S. senator shouldn't serve more than 2 terms, that person's gone. But you see, we don't want to do that. We don't want to educate the people. We don't want to go through the work of convincing other people of our point of view. We would much rather have the bullies in government force our opinion on them. Because that's what term limits is. It's government forcing you to choose a different person. Now, whether you think that's a good idea or bad, that's what it is. And in a time in our country when our rights are being restricted and infringed on more and more and more, do you really want to give the government the power to tell you who is and is not the best person to serve in that office? No, term limits is not the answer. Term limits just changes the player while we go down the drain. If we truly want term limits, if we truly want better people in office, we have to start by educating the American people. What is the role of that office? What are the duties of that office? What is the oath that person swore in that office? And then how do we evaluate that person? And if you think there should be term limits on an individual office, then all you have to do is convince enough of your neighbors that that is the case, and it becomes true. It's just we don't want to go through the work. So for all of you who've argued with me, debated with me about term limits, there's my answer. But there's one other point I want to make. How many of you have heard the term lame duck? We all have, right? It refers to an office holder who's no longer worried about getting reelected. Does anybody remember when President Obama was coming up for reelection and he told the then president of Russia, Medvedev, to tell Putin to just be calm, once I get past this election, I'll have a lot more freedom to do whatever I want. Term limits turns every elected office into a lame duck. Today, a lame duck Congress, well, they only sit for a few months. They're elected in November, they're changed in January. So you've got November, December, part of January, you've got 2.5, 3 months, voila, that's their window of opportunity. What happens with term limits? What happens when a congressman has 2 years as a lame duck without any worry of getting reelected? What happens when a senator has 6 years as a lame duck? We thought the president was bad. What happens when significant portions of Congress are lame ducks? They don't have to worry about what they say or what they do, whether or not it would hurt their reelection possibilities, because they can't get reelected. Term limits, rather than making things better, make things a lot worse. It turns us into a parliament where the seat is not held by a person, but by a party. It removes the natural restraints that an elected official has trying to get reelected. And it's done because of the fact that some people don't like who other people are choosing to represent them. They want to enforce their will on others. So no, I'm not for term limits. Hopefully now you're at least questioning if you're for them yourself. If you disagree with me, put it in the comments. I'm willing to listen. I'll take any reasonable, rational argument. I'm not saying I have the perfect answer, but I see a lot more problems with term limits than I do with educating the American people. The problem is it takes longer. It's because you don't use bullies to implement it. But hopefully this got you thinking, it got you engaged, you found it worthwhile, and hopefully you'll come back so we can talk about things the next time on the Constitution Study.
There's one thing you have to know wherever you make your stand. Came from a long through line of everyday